People look at me and they see a uniform. They see a gavel. They see a woman who has spent decades telling people exactly what she thinks, often without a filter, often without a shred of sympathy for excuses. After 25 years on the bench, that reputation, the steel judge, the cold-hearted arbiter, it sticks. I built my career on efficiency. I built it on the principle that the courtroom is a place for facts, for law, for order, not for tears, not for sob stories. But there is a fundamental misunderstanding about what that room actually is. It isn't a cold, empty box. It is a vessel. It is where life, in all its messy, broken, desperate glory, is poured out onto the floorboards for everyone to see. And once in a while, something happens that reminds me that beneath the robes, beneath the procedure, there is a heart that beats to the rhythm of human truth. It was a Tuesday in November, gray, rainy, the kind of day that makes Manhattan feel like it's pressing down on you. I had a docket full of the usual: small claims, debt recovery, landlord, tenant disputes, the stuff that keeps the wheels of the city turning. My clerk, a woman who knows better than to interrupt me unless it's vital, slipped a file onto my desk. Thomas Miller. A dispute over a rental deposit, a few $1,000s. To the court, it was just another case file, a nuisance, a waste of time. But when Thomas Miller walked in, I didn't see a nuisance. I saw a man who looked like he had been carrying a piano on his back for 10 years. He was in his late 60s, wearing a jacket that had seen better days, walking with a stiff, precise gait that told me exactly where he'd been. Not his age. Something else. Discipline. He didn't look at the floor. He stood at that podium, back straight, eyes fixed ahead, and he didn't say a word. He just waited. And in that silence, I felt the air in the room change. It wasn't the usual courtroom tension. It was something heavier, something quiet. I looked at the plaintiff, a corporate property manager, checking her watch, annoyed to be here, and then back at Thomas. I cleared my throat, ready to get the hearing started, but before I could utter the first instruction, he did something I didn't expect. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a small, worn piece of paper, and his hand, the hand of a man who had served his country, began to shake. That's when I knew this wasn't going to be a normal Tuesday. I settled into the chair, the familiar leather creaking under me. Miss Henderson, the plaintiff, didn't wait for an invitation. She launched into a rehearsed monologue about contractual obligations, unpaid balances, and damage to property. She was clinical, aggressive, and entirely focused on the bottom line. She spoke like a person who had recited the same speech in a dozen different courtrooms, treating this hearing as nothing more than a speed bump in her day. She didn't look at Thomas. To her, he wasn't a human being with a history. He was a liability on a balance sheet. I let her talk for a full minute, watching her. I always let them talk. It's the best way to see the measure of a person. She was precise, cold, and utterly dismissive. When she finally took a breath to emphasize the late fees, I held up a hand. The room went dead silent. "Miss Henderson," I said, my voice cutting through the stuffy air of the courtroom, "I didn't ask for a lecture on your company's policy manual. I asked for the facts of this case. You're here for a few $1,000s. You're acting as if this man is a criminal mastermind, yet I'm looking at his file, and he lived in your unit for 8 years without a single complaint until this summer. What changed?" She blinked, momentarily thrown off her rhythm. "Your Honor, the lease is the lease. He stopped paying. He abandoned the property in the middle of the night. It's a clear violation." I turned my gaze away from her and looked directly at Thomas Miller. He was still standing there, his shoulders hunched, his eyes fixed on a spot on the floor just to the left of my desk. He hadn't defended himself against her accusations. He hadn't interrupted. He just stood there, looking like a man who had already accepted the worst was going to happen. "Mr. Miller," I said, lowering the pitch of my voice, "she says you left in the middle of the night. Is that true?" He looked up. His eyes were glassy, weary, and carried the weight of something that hadn't happened yesterday or last week. It was the weariness of a lifetime. "Your Honor, I didn't want to leave, but the VA benefits, they got reevaluated, and then they were cut. My medication costs tripled. I was choosing between the rent and the things I need to keep breathing." His voice didn't crack, but the simplicity of his statement hit the courtroom harder than any shouting match could have. He wasn't making excuses. He wasn't begging. He was just stating the stark, unvarnished reality of a life that had suddenly, violently, fallen off the tracks. I looked back at Miss Henderson. She was staring at him, not with pity, but with a look of mild irritation, as if he were still wasting her time. I sympathize. Mr. Miller, she added, her voice devoid of any real sympathy. But that doesn't change the fact that I have a business to run. The courtroom felt smaller suddenly. The air grew thick. I didn't look at the plaintiff again. I looked at Thomas, and for a split second, I saw it not just the man, but the veteran. I saw the posture, the way he stood, the way he had tried to maintain his dignity even when the world had stripped him of everything else. Something about the way he gripped the podium, his knuckles white, told me this wasn't about a rent dispute. This was about a man who had reached his breaking point, and I realized then that I wasn't going to let this end the way Miss Henderson wanted it to. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the bench, and fixed my gaze on Mr. Miller. The plaintiff, Miss Henderson, was tapping her foot, clearly eager to get back to her contractual obligations. She opened her mouth to interrupt, but I cut her off with a sharp look, the kind of look that stops proceedings dead in their tracks. I wasn't done with Thomas. Mr. Miller, I said, my voice dropping an octave, becoming more conversational. You mentioned your benefits were reevaluated. How long did you serve? He looked surprised by the question, perhaps conditioned to think that a civil courtroom only cared about ledgers and signatures. 12 years, Your Honor. The Army, Desert Storm, and then logistics in Germany. 12 years. He didn't say it with pride. He said it like it was a dusty fact of his past, almost as if he felt it didn't count anymore because he was standing here in a coat that had seen better days, being sued for a few months of rent. And since you left the service, I prodded. I worked in manufacturing, he replied, his voice steadying, though his hands remained clenched at his sides. I gave everything I had to that plant until my health. Well, the VA rated me for a disability, but it's never enough to keep up with the cost of living, especially when your health starts to decline. The medication costs started taking the lion's share of the budget. I glanced down at the stack of papers in front of me. There was no medical evidence submitted, no documentation of his service record, just the property manager's cold, sterile demand for back pay and legal fees. Miss Henderson, I snapped, finally turning my focus back to her. Did you know he was a veteran? She looked caught off guard, shifting her weight. Your Honor, that isn't relevant to the lease agreement. The contract is very clear about the late payment penalties. It's relevant to the human being standing in my courtroom, I barked. The gavel didn't need to be touched. My tone was enough. This isn't a factory, and these aren't just widgets. We are talking about someone who served this country, and you're trying to squeeze blood from a stone while he's struggling to afford his life-saving medication. You have a heart, don't you? Or did you check it at the door when you walked in? The courtroom felt smaller suddenly. The air grew thick. I didn't look at the plaintiff again. I looked at Thomas, and for a split second, I saw it not just the man, but the soldier. I saw the posture, the way he stood, the way he had tried to maintain his dignity, even when the world had stripped him of everything else. Something about the way he gripped the podium, his knuckles white, told me this wasn't about a rent dispute. This was about a man who had reached his breaking point. He wasn't here to be coddled. He was here because he felt like he had failed his duty to himself, and that was the real weight he was carrying, not the debt, but the shame of needing help he couldn't afford to ask for. Miss Henderson, let's talk about this abandonment you keep harping on. I didn't need to look at the paperwork to know that abandonment in her terms was likely a desperate man trying to find a lifeline. You're a property manager, not a machine. Or are you? You're telling me that after 8 years of this man paying on time, being a model tenant, you chose to initiate aggressive eviction proceedings the moment he was a week late? Did you even pick up the phone to ask if he was okay? She stiffened, her jaw tightening. Your Honor, the lease is very specific about the timeline for late payments and default procedures. We have to be consistent. I don't care about the policy manual. I care about the people. I snapped, my voice ringing off the walls of the courtroom. There is a profound difference between being a businesswoman and being a human being. Right now, I'm struggling to see which one you are. You're asking for thousands of dollars in fees, legal costs, and damages for an apartment that I suspect you've already re-rented to someone paying higher market rates. Isn't that right? She faltered, glancing at her files. That is standard procedure for turnover, Your Honor. It has no bearing on the breach of contract. Standard procedure, I echoed, shaking my head. It's always standard procedure when people want to ignore the cost of what they're doing. But let's look at the reality here. I turned my full attention back to Thomas. Mr. Miller, tell me about the night you left. His voice was barely a whisper, but in the absolute silence of the court, every word hit like a hammer. The VA office. They kept me on hold for 3 hours, Your Honor. When they finally answered, they told me the funds were frozen due to a clerical error on their end. I sat in that apartment for 2 days, just staring at the wall, thinking, if I walk out, at least I won't be a burden anymore. I didn't want to leave, but I knew if I stayed, the debt would just pile up until I couldn't breathe. I left the keys on the counter. I left the place cleaner than I found it. I couldn't stay and watch myself fail. The courtroom felt smaller suddenly. The air grew thick. I didn't look at the plaintiff again. I looked at Thomas, and for a split second, I saw it not just the man, but the soldier. I saw the posture, the way he stood, the way he had tried to maintain his dignity even when the world had stripped him of everything else. It wasn't about the money. It was about a man who had reached his breaking point. He wasn't here to be coddled. He was here because he felt like he had failed his duty to himself, and that was the real weight he was carrying, the shame of needing help he couldn't afford to ask for. The plaintiff shifted uncomfortably, but for the first time, she wouldn't meet my eyes. I looked back at Miss Henderson, the corporate shield still firmly in place. She was waiting for me to acknowledge her right to the money. She was waiting for the gavel to drop in her favor, based on the cold, hard text of a lease agreement. Miss Henderson, I began, my voice steady, cold, and razor-sharp. You talk about consistency. You talk about policy. You want me to treat this man like he's a piece of furniture you're discarding because it's no longer convenient for your bottom line. But this isn't a factory floor. This is a courtroom. And in my courtroom, we deal in justice, not just contracts. She started to interrupt. Your Honor, the late fees. Quiet, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. The authority behind the word was enough. When you accepted that rent check from a veteran for 8 years, you weren't just signing a piece of paper. You were entering into a community. You were housing a human being who has given more to this country than you will ever understand from behind your mahogany desk. I stood up, walked to the edge of the bench, and leaned over. I wanted her to see the conviction in my eyes. Do you think for 1 second that a judge who has spent decades seeing the worst of humanity is going to sit here and sign off on your greed? You know as well as I do that this unit is already being prepped for the next tenant. You haven't lost a cent, Miss Henderson. You've only lost your sense of decency. I saw the color drain from her face. She was realizing, perhaps for the first time, that her legal standing, the piece of paper she'd been holding onto like a holy relic, meant nothing in the face of a moral truth. The court was no longer on her side. I turned back to Thomas. He was still standing there, but the slouch in his shoulders had lessened. He was watching me, and for the first time his eyes weren't fixed on the floor. They were fixed on me, with a mixture of confusion and a flicker of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a very long time, dignity. Mr. Miller, I said, my voice softening, you didn't abandon that apartment. You chose to keep your self-respect. There is no shame in that. And I am going to make sure that this system, which you serve so faithfully, acknowledges the difference between a man who failed his lease and a man who is simply surviving a storm. The plaintiff finally looked down at her files, her posture deflating. The power dynamic in the room had shifted, completely and irreversibly. She knew she had lost, and she knew exactly why. And for the first time in this case, the truth was the only thing that mattered. Miss Henderson, I said, my voice cutting through the silence like a scalpel, you keep talking about the terms of the contract as if they are divine law, but you chose to enforce those terms without a single ounce of human discretion. You didn't just evict a tenant, you evicted a human being from his dignity. She opened her mouth, likely to cite the lease agreement once more, but I held up my palm, a gesture that carried the weight of my entire career. Do not, I warned, say another word about the lease. I have read the contract. I know what it says. What I'm interested in right now is why, in a city that prides itself on progress and community, a property manager feels it is acceptable to treat a veteran, a man who gave 12 years of his life in service to this country, like he's a piece of trash to be swept out the back door. I turned my chair slightly to face the courtroom gallery, catching the eyes of the few people who had wandered in to watch the morning session. This is what happens when people forget that the law is meant to serve people, not just ledgers. When you sign a contract, you are signing up for a relationship. And in this relationship, there is a baseline of decency that no contract can override. I swiveled back to the plaintiff. Her composure was finally cracking. She wasn't just annoyed anymore. She was realizing that her rigid adherence to policy was being dismantled right in front of her. Mr. Miller, I said, my tone shifting instantly from stern to gentle. When you left that apartment, you didn't leave because you wanted to break a contract. You left because you were in a situation where the system had failed you, and you were too proud to let it break you completely. You took the keys back to them, didn't you? I did, Your Honor, Thomas whispered. I made sure it was clean. I left my forwarding address in case there was any issue. And did you receive that address? I asked, looking at Miss Henderson. She hesitated, looking down at her files. I believe it was in the file. Yes. And did you reach out? I pressed. Did you, in those 8 years of him being a perfect tenant, ever think to pick up the phone when he was late for the first time in his life? She was silent. That silence was the most damning piece of evidence I had seen all day. It told me everything I needed to know about the lack of character in that boardroom. I looked down at the documents, picked up my pen, and signed the order to dismiss the claims with a force that echoed through the room. I wasn't just throwing out a case. I was throwing out a mindset. Case dismissed. With prejudice, I said, my voice echoing off the courtroom walls. The words carried a finality that seemed to suck the air out of the room. Miss Henderson looked as if she had been slapped. She started to protest, her face flushing with indignation, but one look from me, that signature, ironclad stare, sealed her lips instantly. She didn't have a leg to stand on, and for the first time, the realization dawned on her that policy was no shield for a lack of conscience. Thomas Miller stood frozen for a second. He was processing the weight lifting off his chest, the reality of the situation washing over him. He finally looked at me, really looked at me, and I saw a man who had been invisible for a very long time, suddenly being seen. He didn't thank me with empty, flowery words. He simply nodded, a slow, deliberate movement of a man who had regained his footing. He didn't need to say anything. The profound relief in his posture spoke volumes, more than any speech he could have delivered. I didn't let the room dissolve into the usual chaotic shuffle of the next case just yet. I turned back to the gallery, to the few observers sitting in the back who usually treat these hearings like a midday soap opera. You look at someone like Mr. Miller, I addressed them, my voice measured and sharp, and you see a face in the crowd. You see a number on a rent roll. But you don't see the sacrifice that bought the freedom you used to sit in this room and judge your neighbors. If we, as a society, cannot show a baseline of respect for those who protected us, then what exactly is this system protecting? We are not just a collection of contracts and balance sheets. We are a community, or we are nothing at all. Miss Henderson gathered her briefcase, her face a mask of cold professionalism, though her hands were visibly trembling. She had lost more than money today. She had lost the moral high ground, and in my courtroom, that is a defeat you don't simply recover from. She walked out, her pace hurried, eager to escape the scrutiny of the truth. Thomas walked toward the exit. He stopped at the heavy oak doors, turned back, and gave a sharp, crisp salute not to me, but to the bench itself, to the institution of justice he had spent his youth defending. Then, he was gone, stepping out into the Manhattan rain, a man who had walked in carrying the weight of the world, and walked out standing a little taller. I sat back in my chair, the heavy mahogany of my desk, feeling more like a burden than a pedestal. The courtroom was empty now, the silence echoing in the space where Thomas Miller had stood just moments ago. My clerk, who has been with me for long enough to read my moods by the way I set my pen down, didn't say a word. She just brought me a fresh cup of coffee and closed the door. People ask me, after all these years, if I ever get tired of the no-nonsense persona, if I ever feel the itch to be softer, to be more forgiving. And I tell them the same thing. Compassion isn't about being soft. Compassion is about having the courage to see the truth when it's uncomfortable. It's about the spine, not the tears. I kept thinking about Thomas. I thought about the thousands of veterans, the thousands of people just like him, men and women who have spent their lives building the foundation that the rest of us stand on, only to find themselves standing on the precipice of ruin because of a clerical error or a temporary setback. We treat them as statistics. We treat them as problems to be managed. But when you look at them, really look at them, you see that the system doesn't just need a judge. It needs a witness. My father used to say that a law that doesn't serve the people is a law that has failed its purpose. Today, for a few minutes, we remembered that purpose. We didn't just dismiss a debt. We restored a sense of dignity to a man who had earned it 1,000 times over in the service of this nation. If you've stuck with me through this, if you believe that justice should be about more than just numbers and policies, then you understand why I show up every single day. This channel isn't just a place for courtroom clips. It's a place to remind ourselves that the law belongs to everyone, not just the wealthy, not just the powerful, but the people who show up and do the right thing when nobody is watching. If you believe in that kind of justice, hit that subscribe button, turn on the notifications, because as long as there are people standing in my courtroom, I'll be here to make sure they are seen, heard, and treated with the respect they deserve. I'm Judge Judy Sheindlin, and until next time, do the right thing.